Today we're going to touch on the greatest crisis America has ever faced, when the Union disintegrated and then went into a civil war, which was by far the most traumatic event in American history. Unlike its foreign wars of the 20th century wars, this was a war which by its very nature took place on home soil. The talk is divided into 4 parts. Part 1, books and movies. Part 2, the when and where of the Civil War. Part 3, the impact. And Part 4, a tale of 2 battles 50 years apart. Let's start with books and movies. More than 50,000 books and pamphlets have been written about the Civil War. More than 16,000 books have been written about Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States during the war. More movies have been made about the Civil War than any other event in American history. So where do you start if you want to know something about the war without getting obsessed about it, without becoming a Civil War buff? There are 3 things you can do. The first is to read non-fiction. Obviously the most reliable way to get to know about the past. And there I recommend that you read only one book. It's called The Battle Cry of Freedom, written by James M. Macpherson and published in 1988 by the Oxford University Press. Macpherson won the Pulitzer Prize for the book. Now I hope that you've got a list of 1,000 things to do before you die. Perhaps that list is shrinking a bit. Perhaps it's around about 100 now. In my case, it's getting close to 50. But if you've got that list and you're a reader, please read this book. It is a fantastic book. The Civil War is described as the first photographed war. But the technology of the time did not allow for any movement to take place while the photograph was being taken, otherwise it was a blur. So you have 2 types of photographs. The one is posed, such as in a studio, and the other is photographs of battlefields, where the people in the photographs don't move because they can't, they're all dead. The most disturbing photograph is of a young Union soldier. He lies naked facing the camera. His body consists of his skeleton covered in skin. There is no flesh on him at all. So how come he was reduced to that state by his fellow Americans? He had the misfortune to be imprisoned in a prisoner of war camp at Andersonville in Georgia. And the South had built this camp in the form of a stockade. The only fresh water was a stream that ran through the camp. The stream soon became polluted. Some 30,000 prisoners were packed into this camp. No provision was made for shelter for them. It was said that the life expectancy of a healthy young Union soldier on entering the camp was 1 month. The men died of starvation and disease. 13,000 died at Andersonville. And after the war, the commandant of the camp, a man who originally came from Switzerland, Henry Wirtz, was tried for war crimes, convicted, sentenced to death, and hanged. Now, before I move on to the next topic, I want to say to you that in this paper is an annexure. And in the annexure is a story of 3 books on the Civil War. I'm going to tell you one of those stories today, and it acts as an introduction to one of the main characters. The story is about the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant ended the war as the commander-in-chief of all Union armies. Congress created a special rank for him, Lieutenant General. It is said of Grant that he was one of the 2 architects of Union victory, the other being Abraham Lincoln. At the end of the war, he did an Eisenhower. He went into politics, and he became president in 1868, again in 1872, And at the end of his second term, he and his wife Julia went on a world cruise. And it may fairly be said that in his day, Grant was probably what we call a celebrity, particularly in the United States and, of course, in the North. Life should have been a happy one for Grant. Then in 1884, disaster struck in two forms. Firstly, he lost all his money in a financial scam. He was destitute. And secondly, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. So there was pressure on Grant to earn money and to earn it quickly so that Julia could be supported in her old age. And Grant had a career as an entrepreneur of almost complete and utter failure. So the question was, how was he going to make money under pressure? And he was offered a contract to write his memoirs. And before he could sign the contract, a friend of his called Mark Twain said to him, hang on. Before you sign one of those contracts, let me be your publisher. I have just established my own publishing house. I have just published very successfully a book, and I'll ensure that Julia gets the lion's share of the royalties. So Grant very wisely agrees with Mark Twain, and Grant starts dictating his memoirs. He then, after a while, couldn't dictate because he couldn't talk because of the cancer, and so he wrote it out in longhand, and he finished the second volume shortly before he died. And then Julia got a royalty check after the publication of the first volume for $250,000. This is in about 1885. The biggest royalty payment ever in American history until that time. And recently I read the William Manchester biography of Churchill, the third volume which has recently come out. And there the author tells the story about how during the Second World War, one of the books that Churchill read when he was under all that pressure, when he wasn't drinking, of course, was to read Grant's memoirs. Now we get to part two, the when and where of the Civil War. Let's start with the when. On the 6th of November, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States of America. He was elected with only 40% of the popular vote. He won all the electoral votes in the North except for those of New Jersey. He won no electoral votes in the South. And in 9 southern slave states, he did not get a single popular vote. In other words, not a single man voted for him in 9 states of the Union. He was the first Republican to be elected president. So outraged were the good people of South Carolina at his election that in December 1860, South Carolina seceded, broke away, to be followed over the next few weeks by 6 other southern slave states. In February 1860, they held a convention. They agreed to form a confederacy. They gave this new country of theirs a name, the Confederate States of America. They adopted a constitution, and they elected a president, Jefferson Davis. On the 4th of March 1861, Lincoln was inaugurated for the first time, and he gave his first inaugural address. It was a long address, and it was aimed entirely at persuading those 7 states to come back into the Union. He was unsuccessful. He then called for volunteers for an army of 75,000. To put that in perspective, in December 1860, the United States Army consisted of 16,000 men. And here's Lincoln calling for an army of 75,000 to suppress the rebellion, was the phrase that he would have used. 4 more states then broke away, bringing the total number in the Confederacy to 11. I'm going to use the term the South every now and then, and when I do, I'm referring to those 11 states. One of those states was Virginia, and its capital, Richmond, was then chosen as the capital of the Confederacy. So you had a rather bizarre geographical happening. which was that the capital of the Union was Washington, D.C., on the northern side of the Potomac River, and Richmond was some distance away, but still relatively short distance, south of the Potomac River. The Civil War that ensued lasted for 4 years, ending in 1865. And as we all know, the South lost, the Union was restored, and there were two other consequences. The one you're aware of, which is putting an end to slavery, which I'll come back to in a moment. But the other, which is not always appreciated, is this: that the Civil War buried for once and for all the proposition that because a state had agreed to join the Union, it could decide to leave the Union. And this was a proposition that had been advanced from time to time, particularly in 1820 and again in 1850, when there were negotiations around the terms on which new states should be admitted to the United States, whether they should be slave states or free states. So what was that United States like in early 1861? Well, if you can imagine the map of the United States of today, the continental United States, then 32 of those states filled the eastern half, with Kansas being the most westerly state. To the west of Kansas were territories, which hadn't attained statehood, and on the west coast were California and Oregon. So you can get a picture of what it looked like. 15 slave states, the rest free states. Now, a shorthand way, I thought when I originally drafted the paper, was to talk of advantages and disadvantages. These were the advantages the North had. It had twice the population that the South had. It was industrialized, whereas the South wasn't. It produced more edible crops, and it had twice as many railroad tracks. So if you convert those into the advantages to fight a protracted war, the advantages were on the side of the North. The armies could be twice as big. The soldiers could be, and would be in the end, better fed, better clothed, better armed, and the armies could be more mobile. It is said of the Civil War that it is the first war in which railroads played a significant part. And we were at a crossroads called Cold Harbor. Two great armies of the Civil War face each other, as they have by then for nearly 3 years. The Northern Army is called the Army of the Potomac. Wonderful name. Commander-in-Chief, Grant. Ulysses S. Grant. The Southern Army, the Army of Northern Virginia, Commander-in-Chief, Robert E. Lee. The battle is to take place the next day. That night, a Union officer on horseback is walking amongst the men, and he sees them sitting, and they are sewing. So he looks down, he says, "What are you doing?" So the answer comes back, "We are sewing our names onto our uniforms." There were no dog tags in those days or ID discs. And why were these soldiers doing it? So that their bodies could be identified, so that their families could be told what had happened to them. And why were they so pessimistic? Because they had seen what Grant had seen but not appreciated, which is that Lee had ordered his men to dig trenches. And they did, in a zigzag pattern, so it didn't matter where the advance came from. Because Lee at this stage was running out of men. He had no prospect of getting replacements. He was short of supplies. Even boots were a problem. Uniforms in tatters. Lee was fighting a defensive war, slowly being pushed back by Grant, who had, as we saw some time ago, twice as many men, better clothed, better armed, and better fed. The day dawned, 3 June, 1864. It started with an artillery barrage by the Union artillery. When that ended, 60,000 Union soldiers marched towards the southern lines. The advance lasted 8 minutes. It stopped when 7,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded and eventually died on that field. A Southern officer said that when he looked across the field in front of him, 5 acres of ground were filled with the bodies of the Union soldiers. And on the body of one Union soldier was found his diary. And in his diary was this entry: June 3, Cold Harbor, I was killed. Thank you.